In a world where battlefields echo with the thunder of gunfire and the whispers of legends, there exists a truth that military academies don't teach in their textbooks. It's the story of how a single moment of underestimation can reshape the entire hierarchy of elite forces. This is not a tale of Hollywood heroics or fictional super soldiers. This is the authentic account of how one woman's request for a rifle became the moment that silenced the most elite military commander in modern warfare. The SEAL community prides itself on being the apex predator of military operations. They are the shadows that move unseen, the precision instruments of warfare that governments deploy when failure is not an option. Their commanders are legends forged in the crucible of impossible missions and unthinkable odds. These are men who have stared death in the face and emerged victorious, who command respect with a single glance, whose very presence can alter the course of military operations. But what happens when such a commander encounters someone whose skills transcend every assumption, every preconceived notion about warfare and capability? What happens when the hunter becomes the hunted, not by an enemy force, but by someone who redefines what it means to be lethal? This is the story of Sarah Chun, though that wasn't the name that would eventually strike fear into the hearts of those who thought they knew what warfare looked like. This is the story of how a woman's simple request for a rifle became the catalyst for a legend that would be whispered in military circles for decades to come. It's a story that begins with laughter and ends with a silence so profound it changed the very DNA of elite military operations. The events that unfolded would challenge everything the military establishment believed about skill, about gender, about the true nature of what makes a warrior. It would prove that sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody takes seriously until it's far too late. Are you ready to discover how a codename born from mockery became the most feared designation in modern military history? The morning sun painted the Nevada desert in shades of gold and amber as Sarah Chun stepped off the military transport helicopter. The rotor wash whipped her dark hair around her face, but she remained perfectly still, her eyes scanning the sprawling military compound that stretched before her like a monument to American military might. This was Blackwater Ridge, the most secretive training facility in the continental United States, where the military's most elite operators came to push the boundaries of human capability. Sarah wore standard military fatigues that seemed almost too large for her slight frame. At 5 feet 4 inches and weighing barely 120 pounds, she looked more like a college student who had accidentally wandered onto a movie set than someone who belonged among the world's deadliest warriors. Her appearance was so unremarkable that the helicopter pilot had actually asked her twice if she was sure she was at the right location. The compound buzzed with the controlled chaos of military precision. Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Marine Force Recon, and Delta Force operatives moved through the facility like apex predators in their natural habitat. These were men forged in the fires of combat, sculpted by years of the most demanding training known to mankind. Their very presence radiated danger. Their movements spoke of countless hours perfecting the art of warfare. Commander Marcus Steele stood on the observation deck overlooking the helicopter landing pad, his weathered face set in its perpetual expression of controlled intensity. At 6 feet 2 inches and 200 pounds of solid muscle, Steele was the embodiment of what most people pictured when they thought of elite military leadership. His chest bore the ribbons of 3 bronze stars, 2 silver stars, and a Navy cross. His arms carried the scars of shrapnel from Fallujah, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of a man who had seen more combat than most soldiers experienced in multiple deployments. Steele commanded SEAL Team 7, arguably the most elite unit within the already elite SEAL community. His men weren't just operators, they were legends in their own right. Each had been handpicked not just for their physical capabilities, but for their mental fortitude, their ability to complete missions that existed in the gray areas between possibility and impossibility. As Sarah approached the main building, conversations began to quiet, not from respect or recognition, but from confusion and barely suppressed amusement. Hardened warriors who had faced down terrorists in Afghanistan and drug cartels in South America found themselves exchanging glances and poorly concealed smirks. The sight of this small woman walking among them seemed so incongruous that some began to wonder if she was a civilian contractor who had somehow ended up in the wrong place. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, Steele's second-in-command, was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. Morrison was a giant of a man, standing 6 feet 5 inches with hands that could palm a basketball and a voice that could cut through the noise of a helicopter rotor. He had earned his reputation in the mountains of Afghanistan, where his marksmanship had become the stuff of legend among both allies and enemies. "Boss," Morrison said, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by the small crowd that had gathered to observe the new arrival. "Please tell me that's not our supposed expert marksman. She looks like she'd be knocked over by the recoil from a .22. The comment triggered a ripple of barely contained laughter throughout the group. These were men who had seen the absolute best that military training could produce. They had worked alongside Marine Scout snipers who could place a round through a target at distances that defied belief. They had observed Army Rangers whose accuracy with a rifle bordered on supernatural. The idea that this slight woman could represent anything approaching their level of capability seemed not just unlikely, but genuinely absurd. Sarah heard the comment, of course. The acoustics of the compound's courtyard carried sound with crystal clarity, and Morrison had made no real effort to lower his voice. But her expression never changed. She continued walking with the same measured pace, her posture straight but relaxed, her eyes taking in every detail of her surroundings with the quiet intensity of someone cataloging information for later use. She had expected this reaction. In fact, she would have been more surprised if it hadn't occurred. Throughout her career, she had encountered this same mixture of skepticism and condescension. It had happened during her time with military intelligence, where her small stature and quiet demeanor had led many to assume she was nothing more than a desk analyst. It had happened during her brief stint with the FBI's hostage rescue team, where seasoned agents had initially treated her like a liability rather than an asset. But Sarah had learned long ago that expectations could be powerful weapons when wielded correctly. While others saw her appearance as a disadvantage, she had come to understand it as perhaps her greatest tactical advantage. People who underestimated her rarely got a second chance to correct their mistake. The briefing was scheduled for 1400 hours in Conference Room Alpha, a sterile, windowless space designed to prevent electronic surveillance. By the time Sarah entered the room, the seats were already filled with some of the most decorated warriors in the American military. Steele sat at the head of the table, his presence dominating the space even in stillness. Around him sat 12 of his hand-picked operators, each one a master of their particular specialty. There was Rodriguez, the team's explosives expert, whose understanding of demolitions had saved countless lives in urban combat environments. Peterson sat next to him, a communications specialist who could establish contact with command from locations where conventional radio equipment simply wouldn't function. Williams, the team medic, had once performed emergency surgery in the middle of a firefight using nothing but a field kit and a flashlight. But perhaps most relevant to the current situation was Thompson, the team's designated marksman. Thompson had graduated first in his class from the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School, had completed additional training with British SAS snipers in Wales, and had recorded confirmed kills at distances exceeding 1,200 meters. His rifle work had become the gold standard by which other military snipers measured themselves. As Sarah took her seat at the opposite end of the table from Steele, the weight of their collective skepticism pressed down on her like a physical force. These men had earned their positions through blood, sweat, and sacrifices that most civilians couldn't begin to comprehend. They had proven themselves in the crucible of combat, where mistakes didn't just mean failure but death for themselves and their teammates. Steele cleared his throat and began the briefing with his characteristic directness. "Gentlemen, we've been assigned a new team member for Operation Nightfall. This is Sarah Chun, who comes to us with recommendations from the highest levels of command." He gestured toward Sarah, and she could feel the weight of 12 pairs of eyes studying her with the intensity that these men typically reserved for enemy targets. She met each gaze steadily, saying nothing, allowing them to complete their assessment. "Ms. Chin's file is largely classified," Steele continued, "but we've been told that her marksmanship capabilities are exceptional. She'll be integrated into our team for the duration of this operation." Morrison leaned back in his chair, the metal frame creaking under his considerable weight. "Commander, with all due respect, this operation is going to take us into some of the most hostile territory we've ever encountered. We're talking about a precision strike in an urban environment with minimal backup and zero margin for error. Are we really expected to trust our lives to someone whose qualifications we can't even review?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. It was a fair question, Sarah had to admit. These men had fought together, bled together, and saved each other's lives more times than they could count. The bonds forged in combat created a level of trust that went beyond mere professional relationships. They were asking her to step into that circle of trust without having earned her place through shared sacrifice. Thompson, the team's marksman, spoke up for the first time. His voice was quiet, but carried the confidence of someone who had never missed when it mattered. "Commander, I've been running scenarios for Nightfall based on our intelligence reports. The shot we're going to need is a minimum of 800 meters in an urban environment with multiple variables including wind patterns affected by surrounding buildings, potential target movement, and civilian considerations. It's going to require someone with extensive combat experience and proven capability under pressure." He paused, his eyes fixed on Sarah. No disrespect intended, but this doesn't seem like the right time for on-the-job training. Sarah finally spoke, her voice calm and clear. "You're right that it's not the time for training, which is why I asked for the rifle." The silence that followed her words was absolute. In that sterile conference room, surrounded by men who had dedicated their lives to perfecting the art of warfare, Sarah's simple statement carried a weight that none of them had expected. Morrison was the first to break the silence, and his response came in the form of laughter. Not malicious laughter, but the kind of genuinely amused response that emerges when someone encounters something so unexpected that their brain needs a moment to process it. "She asked for the rifle," he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. "Boss, I think maybe there's been some kind of miscommunication here." The laughter was contagious. Even Thompson, typically stoic and serious, couldn't suppress a chuckle. Here was this woman, who looked like she might struggle to carry a fully loaded rifle, casually requesting to take the most critical shot of one of their most dangerous operations. But Steele wasn't laughing. He had spent enough years in command to recognize that sometimes the most dangerous people were those who didn't look the part. He had seen young soldiers who appeared barely old enough to perform acts of heroism that would be remembered for generations. He had witnessed moments when assumption and reality collided with devastating results for those who had guessed wrong. "Ms. Chun," he said, his voice cutting through the residual laughter like a blade. "I think what my men are trying to express is that this particular operation requires someone with proven combat experience. Perhaps you could tell us about your background, give us some context for your request." Sarah nodded slowly. She had been expecting this moment since she received her orders. Throughout her career, she had been forced to prove herself repeatedly, not because she lacked capability, but because her appearance made others assume she did. "I understand your concerns, Commander," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "You're right to question bringing someone onto your team without knowing their capabilities. Your men's lives depend on making the right decisions, and you can't make those decisions without accurate information." She paused, allowing her words to settle. "What I can tell you is that I've been training for this type of operation longer than some of your men have been in the military. I've completed advanced marksmanship courses that most people don't even know exist, and I've been studying the details of Operation Nightfall since before you were briefed on it." Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious now. "Studying it is one thing. Executing under pressure is something entirely different. Have you ever taken a shot with lives hanging in the balance?" "Yes," Sarah replied simply. "More times than I care to count." The room fell silent again, but this time the quality of the silence was different. There was something in Sarah's voice, a certainty that couldn't be faked, that gave even the most skeptical team members pause. Thompson studied her face carefully. As a marksman, he had learned to read people, to detect the subtle signs that distinguished confidence from bravado. What he saw in Sarah's expression wasn't the nervous energy of someone trying to prove themselves. It was the calm certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were capable of. "What's your longest confirmed kill?" he asked, his voice professional but probing. Sarah met his gaze steadily. 1,423 meters. Moving target. Urban environment. Night conditions. The number hung in the air like a challenge. Thompson's longest confirmed kill was 1,215 meters, a shot he had made in nearly perfect conditions with ideal equipment and extensive preparation time. The shot Sarah had just described would have been difficult for the most experienced military snipers in the world. "That's impossible," Peterson said flatly. "The physics alone would make that shot nearly impossible even under ideal conditions. In an urban environment at night? No way." Sarah shrugged slightly. The target didn't think it was impossible either. Right up until it happened. Steele found himself in an unusual position. He had spent his entire career making life and death decisions based on incomplete information, but this situation was different. The woman sitting across from him was either the most dangerous person he had ever encountered, or she was living in a fantasy world that could get his entire team killed. "Ms. Chun," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command. "I'm going to be direct with you. My men are the best of the best. They've earned their positions through years of training and combat experience. If you're going to be part of this team, you're going to have to prove that you belong here." "I understand," Sarah replied. "What did you have in mind?" Morrison grinned, an expression that would have been intimidating to most people but didn't seem to faze Sarah in the slightest. "Well, since you asked for the rifle, maybe we should see what you can do with one. There's a range here where we run our qualifications. Standard targets at standard distances. Nothing too complicated." "That sounds reasonable," Sarah agreed. "When would you like to do this?" "How about right now?" Thompson suggested. "No point in waiting around. If you're as good as you claim to be, this shouldn't take long." As the group began to file out of the conference room, Sarah remained seated for a moment, watching the men who would either become her teammates or her critics. She understood that the next few hours would determine not just their opinion of her, but potentially the success or failure of Operation Nightfall. What none of them understood yet was that Sarah Chun hadn't come to Blackwater Ridge to prove herself to them. She had come to complete a mission that had been years in the making. The rifle skills they were about to witness were just one small part of a much larger and more complex operation. As she stood and followed the team toward the door, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. These men had no idea what they were about to witness. They thought they were testing her capabilities, but, in reality, they were about to receive an education in exactly what was possible when skill, preparation, and determination combined in perfect harmony. The firing range at Blackwater Ridge had been designed by people who understood that ordinary training facilities weren't sufficient for extraordinary operators. It featured multiple distance configurations, environmental variables that could be controlled and adjusted, and technology that allowed for precise measurement and analysis of every shot fired. As they walked toward the range, Sarah could hear the quiet conversations taking place around her. The men were placing informal bets on how badly she would embarrass herself. Some wondered if she would even be able to handle the recoil of a military-grade rifle. Others questioned whether she had ever fired anything more powerful than a hunting rifle. None of them suspected that they were about to witness the emergence of a legend. The weapons vault at Blackwater Ridge contained some of the most advanced firearms ever created. Row upon row of rifles, each one representing the pinnacle of military engineering, lined the walls like sleeping predators waiting to be awakened. Thompson led the group to a section containing sniper rifles, his hands moving with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless hours maintaining and operating these precision instruments. He selected an M24 sniper weapon system, the standard rifle used by Army snipers for decades. The weapon was a thing of brutal beauty, weighing just over 12 pounds, and capable of delivering a .308 Winchester round with devastating accuracy at extreme distances. Thompson handled the rifle with the reverence of a craftsman selecting his finest tool. "This is what we'll start with," he announced, his voice carrying the authority of experience. "Standard military sniper rifle, nothing fancy. If you can't handle this, there's no point in moving to more advanced systems." Sarah nodded and accepted the rifle, her hands finding the grip and stock with surprising natural ease. Several of the team members exchanged glances as they watched her examine the weapon. Her movements weren't those of someone unfamiliar with firearms. There was a practiced efficiency in how she checked the action, tested the trigger pull, and examined the scope mounting system. "Range is set up for multiple distances," Morrison explained as they walked onto the firing line. "We'll start at 300 meters, work our way out to 800. Standard paper targets, ideal conditions. This should give us a pretty good idea of what you're capable of." The firing line overlooked a valley that stretched for nearly a mile, with target positions marked at regular intervals. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desert landscape, creating the kind of lighting conditions that could challenge even experienced marksmen. A gentle crosswind of approximately 5 miles per hour added another variable to consider. Williams, the team medic, had positioned himself behind a spotting scope, ready to call out shot placement and provide feedback. His role wasn't just observational. As the team's designated spotter for long-range operations, he had developed an expert understanding of ballistics and environmental factors that affected precision shooting. "Wind is coming from the northwest at about 5 miles per hour, Williams called out. "Temperature is 82 degrees Fahrenheit, humidity at 35%. Barometric pressure is steady." Sarah settled into a prone position behind the rifle, her body adopting the classic shooting stance that had been drilled into snipers for generations. But there was something different about her positioning, a subtle adjustment in her alignment that Thompson couldn't quite place. It wasn't wrong, exactly, but it wasn't exactly what he would have expected from standard military training either. Take your time, Peterson encouraged, though his voice carried the tone of someone who expected to be disappointed. No rush. Just do your best. Sarah's response was to settle deeper into her shooting position and begin what appeared to be a breathing exercise. Her eyes closed for a moment, and her entire body seemed to relax into a state of perfect stillness. When she opened her eyes again, they held a focus that seemed to penetrate the very air itself. The first shot came without warning. One moment Sarah was motionless behind the rifle. The next the weapon had fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the valley. The recoil, which should have been noticeable for someone of her size, seemed to have no effect on her whatsoever. She absorbed the energy and immediately settled back into position as if the rifle were simply an extension of her body. Center ring, Williams called out from behind his spotting scope, his voice carrying a note of surprise. Dead center at 300 meters. Thompson frowned slightly. A good shot, certainly, but not necessarily impressive for someone claiming elite capabilities. Military marksmen were expected to consistently hit center mass at 300 meters under ideal conditions. This shot proved competence, but not exceptional skill. Not bad, Morrison acknowledged. Let's see how you do at 500 meters. The target at 500 meters appeared significantly smaller through the rifle scope, requiring greater precision to achieve a center hit. Environmental factors became more pronounced at this distance, with wind drift and bullet drop requiring careful calculation and compensation. Sarah made a small adjustment to her scope, her movements deliberate and confident. She settled back into her shooting position and again entered that state of perfect stillness that had characterized her first shot. This time, however, the observers noticed something unusual in her breathing pattern. Instead of the standard respiratory control taught in military marksmanship courses, she seemed to be following a different rhythm entirely. The second shot rang out across the valley, and Williams was ready with his assessment almost immediately. Center ring again. Actually, that's about half an inch from dead center. At 500 meters, that's excellent shooting. Now Thompson was paying closer attention. 2 center hits in a row could be luck, but the precision of the second shot suggested something more than chance. The grouping was tighter than what he typically saw from experienced military marksmen, even under ideal conditions. 700 meters, Steele called out, his voice neutral, but his interest clearly piqued. At 700 meters, they were entering the range where even experienced snipers began to struggle. Environmental factors became exponentially more significant, and the margin for error decreased dramatically. Sarah made another scope adjustment, this time more substantial. She seemed to be calculating factors that went beyond the standard considerations taught in military sniper schools. Her eyes moved between the target, the mirage patterns in the valley, and some point in the distance that the observers couldn't identify. Rodriguez, the explosives expert, leaned over to Morrison. Boss, either she's the luckiest person alive, or we might have seriously misjudged this situation. The third shot took longer to set up. Sarah spent nearly 2 minutes in position before firing, her body remaining perfectly motionless throughout the extended preparation period. When the shot finally came, it seemed almost anticlimactic, as if the rifle had discharged itself rather than being fired. Jesus, Williams breathed into his spotting scope. That's got to be less than a quarter inch from dead center at 700 meters. I've never seen grouping like that outside of bench rest competitions. The mood among the observers had shifted noticeably. What had begun as an amusing diversion was transforming into something much more serious. Thompson found himself reevaluating everything he thought he knew about marksmanship. The shots Sarah was making weren't just good. They were approaching the theoretical limits of what was possible with the equipment being used. 800 meters, Steele announced, though his voice now carried a different quality. The skepticism had been replaced by something approaching respect, tinged with a growing sense that they might be witnessing something extraordinary. At 800 meters, the target appeared as little more than a dot through the rifle scope. Wind effects became severe, bullet drop required significant compensation, and even minor variations in ammunition could affect shot placement. This was the distance where many military snipers began to struggle with consistency. Sarah's preparation for this shot was noticeably different from her previous efforts. She spent several minutes studying the environment, her eyes tracking something that the others couldn't see. She made multiple small adjustments to her scope, each one precise and deliberate. Her breathing pattern changed again, adopting a rhythm that seemed almost meditative. When she finally settled into her shooting position, the entire group fell silent. Even the ambient sounds of the desert seemed to fade away, as if nature itself was holding its breath in anticipation. The shot, when it came, seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. At 800 meters, there was a noticeable delay between the sound of the rifle firing and the bullet reaching its target. During that interval, everyone present found themselves holding their breath, waiting for Williams to call out the result. "I need a minute to be sure," Williams said, his voice carrying a note of disbelief. He adjusted his spotting scope, checked the target again, then looked back through the scope a third time. "That's impossible," he finally announced. "That's dead center. Not close to center, not near center. Dead center at 800 meters. Thompson stood up from his position, his expression a mixture of amazement and something approaching concern. In 15 years of military service, he had never seen shooting like this. The precision Sarah was demonstrating went beyond exceptional. It was entering the realm of what military instructors would describe as theoretically perfect. "What's your background?" he asked Sarah directly, his previous skepticism completely evaporated. "Where did you train?" Sarah set the rifle down carefully and sat up from her shooting position. "Various places," she replied, her voice carrying the same calm tone she had maintained throughout the demonstration. "Some official, some not." Morrison was shaking his head in amazement. "Lady, I owe you an apology. That was some of the finest shooting I've ever witnessed. But I have to ask, if you can shoot like that, why isn't your reputation already legend in military circles?" "Because," Sarah replied, standing and brushing dust from her fatigues, "reputation can be a liability in certain types of operations. Sometimes it's more useful to be underestimated." Steele stepped forward, his expression serious. "Ms. Chun, I think it's time for you to be more forthcoming about your background. The kind of shooting we just witnessed doesn't happen by accident. That level of precision requires years of specialized training and extensive combat experience." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Commander, there are aspects of my background that I'm not authorized to discuss. What I can tell you is that I've been preparing for Operation Nightfall specifically for the past 8 months. Every aspect of this mission has been analyzed, every variable has been calculated, and every contingency has been planned for." "Preparing for 8 months?" Peterson interjected. "How could you have been preparing for a mission that was only classified last week?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Sarah realized that she had perhaps revealed more than she intended. The truth was that Operation Nightfall was part of a much larger and more complex intelligence operation, one that had been in development for over 2 years. Her presence on Steele's team wasn't the result of a last-minute assignment. It was the culmination of extensive planning at the highest levels of government. "Sometimes operations take longer to develop than the participants realize," she said carefully. "Intelligence gathering, target analysis, contingency planning, all of that happens long before the operational teams are briefed." Rodriguez, who had been quietly observing the entire exchange, stepped forward. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that's not how military operations work. We get briefed when missions are approved, not months after they've been in development." Sarah realized that she was approaching a line she couldn't cross without revealing classified information that would compromise not just Operation Nightfall, but several other ongoing operations. Her cover story was beginning to develop cracks under the scrutiny of these experienced operators. "You're right that it's unusual," she acknowledged. "Unfortunately, there are aspects of this situation that I'm not authorized to discuss. What I can tell you is that my presence here has been approved at the highest levels, and my qualifications for this specific operation have been thoroughly vetted." Thompson was studying her face with the intensity he typically reserved for target acquisition. Something about Sarah's responses wasn't adding up. Her shooting was undeniably exceptional, possibly the best he had ever witnessed. But her explanations about her background and her knowledge of Operation Nightfall raised questions that she seemed unwilling or unable to answer. "Commander," he said, addressing Steele directly, "I think we need to have a private conversation about this situation. There are some things here that don't make sense." Steele nodded slowly. He had been thinking the same thing. Sarah's shooting abilities were beyond question, but her evasiveness about her background was concerning. In his experience, people who were reluctant to discuss their qualifications usually had something to hide. "Ms. Chun," he said formally, "I think it would be best if you return to your quarters while my team and I discuss how to proceed. We'll reconvene this evening for a more detailed briefing about Operation Nightfall." Sarah nodded, understanding that she was being politely but firmly dismissed. "Of course, Commander. I'll be available whenever you need me." As she walked away from the firing range, Sarah could hear the beginning of an intense conversation behind her. She had expected this moment would come eventually. Her shooting demonstration had been intended to establish credibility, but it had also raised questions that she couldn't answer without compromising operational security. The truth was that Sarah Chun wasn't just an expert marksman assigned to assist with Operation Nightfall. She was the central figure in a much larger and more complex operation, one that had been carefully orchestrated to position her exactly where she needed to be when the time came to execute the most critical mission of her career. Everything that had happened today, the skepticism, the laughter, the shooting demonstration, and the growing respect of Steele's team, had been carefully calculated steps in a larger plan. Operation Nightfall was important, but it was also a cover for something much more significant. As Sarah reached her quarters, she reflected on the day's events. The first phase of her mission had been completed successfully. She had established her capabilities without revealing too much about her true background. Steele's team now knew that she could shoot, but they still had no idea who she really was or what she was really doing at Blackwater Ridge. The next phase would be more dangerous, because it would require her to begin revealing elements of her true mission while maintaining her cover story. But Sarah had been preparing for this operation longer than anyone realized, and she was confident that she could navigate the challenges ahead. What none of them suspected was that in 3 days, everything they thought they knew about warfare, about capability, and about the true nature of elite operations would be turned upside down. The shooting demonstration they had just witnessed was merely a preview of what was to come. Sarah sat on her bunk and began cleaning the rifle she had used for the demonstration, her movements automatic and precise. As she worked, she allowed herself to think about the conversation that was undoubtedly taking place among Steele's team. They would be questioning everything about her, trying to reconcile her obvious skills with her evasive explanations. But they would reach the same conclusion that every military commander reached when faced with exceptional capability. When lives were on the line, results mattered more than background. Sarah's shooting had proven that she could deliver results, and that would ultimately be enough to secure her place on the team. What they didn't understand yet was that her presence on their team wasn't really about Operation Nightfall at all. It was about positioning her for a much larger mission, one that would require her to demonstrate capabilities that went far beyond exceptional marksmanship. In 72 hours, Commander Marcus Steele would understand exactly what kind of operator he had welcomed onto his team. And in that moment of understanding, the legend of the woman they would come to know by her codename would be born. The war room at Blackwater Ridge hummed with quiet tension as dawn broke over the Nevada desert. Commander Steele stood before a wall-mounted display showing satellite imagery of Caracas, Venezuela, the target location for Operation Nightfall. The images revealed a sprawling urban landscape of concrete and steel, where narrow streets wound between towering apartment buildings like arteries through a living organism. Sarah sat at the conference table alongside the 12 members of SEAL Team 7, studying the mission briefings that had been distributed an hour earlier. The documents painted a picture of extraordinary complexity, a hostage situation involving 3 American diplomats, held by a revolutionary group calling themselves the Bolivarian Liberation Front, in a fortified compound deep within the city's most dangerous district. "Intelligence indicates that our targets are being held on the 4th floor of this building," Steele announced, using a laser pointer to highlight a specific structure on the satellite image. "The building is surrounded by hostile territory, with multiple escape routes and defensive positions. Local law enforcement is either unwilling or unable to assist, which means we're going in completely unsupported." Morrison leaned forward in his chair, his massive frame making the furniture creak ominously. "Commander, what's the timeline on this operation? Are we looking at immediate extraction, or is there flexibility in our approach?" "Zero flexibility," Steele replied grimly. "Intelligence suggests that the hostages will be moved to a secondary location within 48 hours. Once that happens, we lose them completely. This is a one-shot operation with no room for error." Thompson studied the building schematics with the intensity he typically reserved for target acquisition. As the team's primary marksman, he would be responsible for providing overwatch during the assault, eliminating any threats that could compromise the extraction. But the urban environment presented challenges that made him uncomfortable. "Sir, the sightlines in this area are extremely limited," he observed. "Most of the surrounding buildings are either too close or at the wrong angles to provide effective overwatch. The best position I can identify is this rooftop here, approximately 850 meters from the target building. He pointed to a location on the map that would require him to navigate through several blocks of hostile territory just to reach his firing position. Even then, the shot would be at the extreme range of his capabilities, complicated by urban wind patterns and the potential for civilian interference. That's going to be a challenging shot even under ideal conditions, Williams added from his position behind Thompson. As the team's spotter, he understood better than anyone the variables that could affect long-range precision in an urban environment. Wind patterns between buildings are unpredictable, will have limited intelligence on target movement, and the angle isn't ideal for clean shot placement. Sarah had been quietly studying the mission materials, but now she spoke for the first time since entering the war room. "Commander, may I suggest an alternative approach?" The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward her. Despite yesterday's shooting demonstration, she was still the newest member of the team, and suggesting tactical modifications on her first operation was an unusual move. "I'm listening," Steele replied, his voice neutral but attentive. Sarah stood and approached the wall display, her finger tracing a path through the satellite imagery. The building's construction and the surrounding environment actually provide several advantages that we haven't considered. The rooftop that Thompson identified is indeed the optimal position for traditional overwatch, but there's another location that would provide a much more direct line of sight. She pointed to a building that appeared to be directly adjacent to the target structure. This location would reduce the shot distance to approximately 400 meters, eliminate most of the urban wind variables, and provide a much clearer view of all potential target areas. Thompson studied the position she had indicated, his expression skeptical. That building is in the middle of hostile territory. Getting to that position would require infiltrating deep into enemy-controlled areas, and extraction would be nearly impossible if things go wrong. "That's true," Sarah acknowledged. "But it would also provide tactical advantages that could be decisive for mission success." Rodriguez, the explosives expert, was shaking his head. "Ma'am, with all due respect, that position would be suicide. We'd be completely surrounded by hostile forces with no backup and no escape route. If anything goes wrong during the operation, whoever takes that position isn't coming home." The room erupted in a chorus of agreement from the team members. These were experienced operators who had learned to calculate risk versus reward with their lives hanging in the balance. The position Sarah was suggesting violated every principle of tactical planning they had been taught. But Steele was studying the map with renewed interest. Something about Sarah's suggestion had triggered his tactical instincts, and he was beginning to see possibilities that hadn't occurred to him initially. "Ms. Chun," he said slowly, "are you volunteering to take that position?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Everyone in the room understood what Steele was really asking. The position Sarah had identified would be a one-way ticket for whoever occupied it. Even if the mission succeeded, extraction from that location would be extremely difficult under the best circumstances. "Yes, sir," Sarah replied without hesitation. "I believe that position offers the best chance for mission success, and I'm willing to take the associated risks." Morrison stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Commander, this is insane. We're talking about sending our newest team member into the most dangerous position possible on her first operation. It's not just risky, it's irresponsible." "I agree with Morrison," Peterson added. "We've worked together as a team for years. We know each other's capabilities and limitations. Putting someone in that kind of position when we don't fully understand their background or experience is asking for disaster." Williams nodded his agreement. "Sir, yesterday's shooting demonstration was impressive, but this operation is going to require more than marksmanship skills. Whoever takes that position needs to be able to navigate through hostile territory, establish a firing position under combat conditions, and potentially survive extended contact with enemy forces." Sarah listened to their concerns without interrupting, understanding that their objections came from legitimate professional experience rather than personal animosity. These men had survived countless operations because they approached each mission with careful planning and calculated risk assessment. "Your concerns are valid," she said when they had finished. "But there are aspects of this situation that you may not be considering. The position I've identified doesn't just offer tactical advantages for the immediate mission. It also provides contingency options that could be crucial if the primary plan encounters complications." Thompson was studying her face with the intensity he typically reserved for target identification. Something in Sarah's tone suggested that she knew more about this operation than she had previously revealed. What kind of contingency options? He asked directly. Sarah moved to the map display and began pointing out features that hadn't been discussed in the initial briefing. This building has multiple access points that could be used for infiltration or extraction. The rooftop provides sightlines not just to the target building, but to 3 of the 4 potential escape routes that the hostage takers might use if they detect our approach. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Most importantly, this position would allow for immediate response if the hostage situation changes unexpectedly. If they move the prisoners, if additional hostile forces arrive, or if the extraction team encounters problems, someone in this position could adapt in real time rather than being locked into a predetermined plan. Steele was beginning to understand that Sarah's tactical thinking operated on a different level from what he typically encountered. Most operators, even the most experienced ones, focused on executing predetermined plans with precision and efficiency. Sarah seemed to be thinking in terms of dynamic adaptation and real-time problem-solving. Ms. Chun, he said, your tactical analysis is sound, but it raises questions about your background that I need answered before I can authorize this approach. The kind of thinking you're demonstrating suggests experience with operations that go beyond standard military training. Sarah met his gaze directly, understanding that she had reached another decision point in maintaining her cover story. The mission analysis she had just provided revealed capabilities that couldn't be easily explained by conventional military experience. Commander, there are aspects of my background that I'm not authorized to discuss, she replied carefully. What I can tell you is that I've been involved in operations similar to this one, and I understand the variables and contingencies that need to be considered. Rodriguez leaned back in his chair, his expression troubled. Ma'am, that's not really an answer. We're being asked to trust our lives to someone whose background we can't verify and whose experience we can't evaluate. The room fell silent as the team grappled with the fundamental question that had been underlying all their interactions with Sarah. She had demonstrated exceptional shooting skills and tactical awareness, but she remained an enigma whose true capabilities and background were unknown. Thompson broke the silence with a question that went directly to the heart of their concerns. Sarah, can you give us anything concrete about your background? Any verifiable information that would help us understand who we're working with? Sarah considered her response carefully. She was operating under strict orders to maintain her cover story, but she was beginning to realize that complete evasiveness might compromise the mission more than selective disclosure. I can tell you that I've completed advanced training with several government agencies whose programs aren't publicly acknowledged, she said slowly. I've been involved in operations in urban environments similar to Caracas, including situations where traditional tactical approaches weren't viable. Morrison frowned. What kind of agencies? Military? Intelligence? Law enforcement? Yes, Sarah replied, which was technically accurate while revealing almost nothing. Williams shook his head in frustration. That's like saying you've eaten food before when someone asks about your cooking experience. We need specifics if we're going to trust you with our lives. Sarah understood their frustration, but she also understood that she was approaching the limits of what she could reveal without compromising operational security. The truth was that her background involved agencies and operations that most military personnel didn't even know existed. Steele stood up and moved to the window overlooking the compound courtyard. For several minutes, he said nothing, weighing the tactical advantages Sarah had identified against the risks of working with an operator whose background remained largely unknown. Ms. Chun, he finally said, I'm going to authorize your proposed approach, but with conditions. You'll be accompanied by one of my men who will serve as both spotter and backup. If anything goes wrong, his priority will be mission completion, not your extraction. Sarah nodded her acceptance. That's reasonable, Commander. Who did you have in mind? Thompson, Steele replied without hesitation. He knows the tactical requirements better than anyone else on the team, and his experience will provide the backup you'll need if things go sideways. Thompson looked surprised by the assignment, but he nodded his agreement. Yes, sir. But I want it understood that if this position turns out to be as dangerous as I think it is, my priority will be completing the mission and protecting the team, not individual survival. Understood and agreed, Sarah replied. Commander, when do we deploy? Steele checked his watch. Transportation leaves in 6 hours. That gives us time for detailed planning and final equipment checks. I want everyone to understand that this is a high-risk operation with minimal backup. Once we're on the ground in Caracas, we'll be completely on our own. As the team began filing out of the war room to prepare for deployment, Thompson approached Sarah with an expression that mixed professional respect with personal concern. "Sarah, I want you to know that I think you're either very brave or completely insane for volunteering for this position. Either way, I'll have your back during the operation." Sarah smiled, the first genuinely warm expression she had shown since arriving at Blackwater Ridge. "Thompson, there's something you should understand about me. I don't volunteer for anything unless I know I can deliver. Tomorrow, you're going to see exactly what that means." As the room emptied, Sarah remained behind for a moment, studying the satellite imagery of Caracas one final time. The position she had identified would indeed be dangerous, but it was also exactly where she needed to be to complete the real mission she had been assigned. Operation Nightfall was important, and she intended to ensure its success. But it was also providing cover for a much more significant objective, one that required her to be in precisely the position she had just volunteered for. In 18 hours, the men of SEAL Team 7 would finally understand exactly what kind of operator they had welcomed into their ranks. And in that moment of understanding, the legend that would eventually silence Commander Steele himself would begin to take shape. The mission that was about to unfold would test every assumption they had made about capability, about preparation, and about what was possible when skill and determination combined with planning that extended far beyond what any of them suspected. Sarah gathered her materials and headed toward the equipment room to prepare for deployment. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions that hadn't even been asked yet. And those answers would change everything about how these elite operators understood the nature of warfare in the modern world. The transport helicopter cut through the pre-dawn darkness above the Caribbean Sea, its rotors beating a steady rhythm against the humid tropical air. Inside the cramped passenger compartment, the members of SEAL Team 7 performed their final equipment checks with the methodical precision of men who understood that details meant the difference between life and death. Sarah sat near the rear of the aircraft, her gear arranged with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized everything about her performance since arriving at Blackwater Ridge. Her rifle case contained a custom-built precision weapon that none of the team members had seen before, along with ammunition that appeared to be manufactured to specifications that exceeded military standards. Thompson occupied the seat beside her, his role as spotter requiring him to carry additional equipment for target identification and range calculation. Despite his initial skepticism about the mission profile, he had spent the previous evening working with Sarah to develop contingency plans for every scenario they could imagine. 15 minutes to insertion, the helicopter pilot announced through the aircraft's internal communication system. Weather conditions are optimal, but intelligence reports suggest increased activity in the target area. Steele's voice crackled through their headsets in response. "Define increased activity. Are we looking at military forces or irregular combatants?" "Unknown at this time, sir. Satellite imagery shows more vehicle movement than normal, but we can't identify the nature of the activity from this distance." Morrison leaned forward from his position near the aircraft's door. "Commander, does this change our approach? If there are additional hostile forces in the area, our extraction timeline could be compromised." Steele considered the question for several seconds before responding. "Negative. We proceed as planned. Intelligence indicates that any delay could result in the hostages being moved to a location where extraction becomes impossible. We adapt to conditions on the ground." Sarah listened to the exchange while mentally reviewing the mission profile one final time. The plan called for the team to insert via helicopter at a landing zone approximately 3 kilometers from the target building. From there, they would split into 2 groups. The main assault team would approach the target building through a predetermined route, while Sarah and Thompson would navigate to the overwatch position she had identified. The timing was critical. Sarah and Thompson needed to be in position and ready to provide supporting fire before the assault team began their approach. Any delay in reaching the overwatch position could leave the assault team vulnerable during the most dangerous phase of the operation. 5 minutes to insertion, the pilot announced. "Landing zone appears clear, but maintain readiness for immediate extraction if conditions change." The team members began their final preparations, checking weapons and communications equipment one last time. The helicopter began its descent toward a small clearing in the jungle that would serve as their insertion point, the aircraft's engines changing pitch as the pilot maneuvered through the challenging terrain. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of adrenaline beginning to flow through her system, the chemical response that would sharpen her focus and enhance her performance during the critical hours ahead. But Unlike the nervous energy she observed in some of the other team members, her adrenaline response was controlled and purposeful, the result of training and experience that went beyond what any of them suspected. The helicopter touched down with barely a bump, and the team began filing out of the aircraft with practiced efficiency. Within 30 seconds, all personnel and equipment were clear of the landing zone, and the helicopter was lifting off again, its lights disappearing into the darkness as it headed back toward international waters. The jungle around them was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, but it was the absence of certain sounds that captured Sarah's attention. There were no human noises, no mechanical sounds, no indicators of the urban environment they were approaching. The silence suggested that they had indeed landed undetected, but it also meant that they were completely on their own from this point forward. Steele assembled the team in a tight circle for final coordination. Remember, communications will be limited once we separate. Thompson and Chun, you have 45 minutes to reach your position and establish overwatch. The assault team will begin approach at exactly 0300 hours. Any questions? Rodriguez raised his hand. Sir, what's our fallback plan if the overwatch position turns out to be compromised? Do we abort or adapt? We adapt, Sarah answered before Steele could respond. The position I've identified has multiple contingency options. Even if the primary location is compromised, there are alternative positions that can provide the necessary support. Thompson looked at her with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. Sarah, you're talking like you've actually been to this location before. How can you be so confident about contingency positions based on satellite imagery? The question highlighted a contradiction that had been bothering Thompson throughout their preparation. Sarah's tactical planning demonstrated knowledge of the target area that seemed to exceed what could be derived from intelligence briefings and satellite photos. Experience with similar environments, Sarah replied, which was technically accurate while revealing nothing about her actual background. Urban combat situations share certain characteristics regardless of specific location. Morrison stepped forward, his massive frame imposing even in the dim jungle light. Ma'am, with respect, that's not really an answer. Thompson is right to be concerned. You're displaying knowledge that suggests direct familiarity with this area. Sarah met his gaze steadily. Morrison, in 2 hours you're going to understand exactly how I know what I know. Until then, I need you to trust that I can deliver what I've promised. Steele intervened before the conversation could escalate further. We don't have time for extended discussion. Thompson, Chun, move out. Everyone else, we follow Route Alpha to the staging area. Sarah and Thompson separated from the main group and began their approach toward the target area. The jungle gave way gradually to urban sprawl, with scattered buildings and increasingly paved surfaces replacing the natural terrain. Their route took them through residential areas where the poverty was evident even in the darkness, with ramshackle housing and inadequate infrastructure creating an obstacle course of hazards. Thompson moved with the practiced stealth of an experienced operator, but he soon realized that Sarah's movement through the urban environment was exceptional even by military standards. She seemed to anticipate obstacles before encountering them, choosing routes that avoided potential detection points and minimizing their exposure to observation from surrounding buildings. How are you doing that? He whispered as they paused in the shadow of an abandoned vehicle. It's like you can see around corners. Sarah smiled in the darkness. Urban environments have patterns. Once you understand the patterns, navigation becomes much more predictable. They continued their approach, with Sarah leading them through a maze of streets and alleys that brought them steadily closer to their objective. Thompson began to notice that their route, while indirect, was actually more efficient than the path he would have chosen based on the satellite imagery they had studied. After 35 minutes of careful movement, they reached the building Sarah had identified as their overwatch position. The structure was a 5-story apartment building that appeared to be partially abandoned, with several broken windows and evidence of limited occupancy. How do you want to approach this? Thompson asked, studying the building for signs of activity or potential threats. Front door, Sarah replied matter-of-factly. Sometimes the most direct approach is the least expected. Thompson stared at her in disbelief. Are you serious? We're just going to walk up to the front door of a building in hostile territory and knock? Not exactly, Sarah said, producing a key from one of her equipment pouches. Thompson's expression shifted from disbelief to genuine confusion. Where did you get a key to this building? Sarah inserted the key into the front door lock and turned it quietly. The door opened without resistance, revealing a darkened hallway that led to a staircase heading toward the upper floors. Preparation, Sarah replied, stepping into the building and motioning for Thompson to follow. As they climbed the stairs toward the rooftop, Thompson's mind raced with questions that he was beginning to realize might never be answered. The key to the building, Sarah's knowledge of the area, her confidence about contingency positions, all of it suggested a level of preparation and intelligence gathering that went far beyond what was typical for military operations. The rooftop provided exactly the view that Sarah had promised during their planning session. The target building was clearly visible approximately 400 meters away, with multiple sight lines to all potential entry and exit points. The position was tactically superior to anything Thompson could have imagined based on their satellite imagery. "This is incredible," Thompson admitted as he set up his spotting scope. "The sightlines are perfect, the range is optimal, and we have visual coverage of the entire operational area. How did you identify this position from satellite photos?" Sarah was assembling her rifle with movements that seemed automatic and unconscious. "Because I've been here before." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Thompson looked up from his equipment setup, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding to something approaching concern. "What do you mean you've been here before?" Sarah finished assembling her rifle and settled into her shooting position. "Thompson, there are aspects of this operation that are more complex than you've been told. Operation Nightfall is important, but it's also providing cover for a larger mission." Thompson's training kicked in as he realized that the mission parameters might not be what he had understood them to be. "Sarah, what exactly is your real objective here?" Before Sarah could respond, the sound of gunfire erupted from the direction of the target building. The assault team had encountered resistance earlier than expected, and the mission timeline had just accelerated dramatically. "Contact south side of target building," Morrison's voice crackled through their communications equipment. "Multiple hostiles requesting immediate overwatch support." Sarah's rifle was already trained on the target building. Her scope focused on the windows where muzzle flashes indicated enemy positions. "I have visual on 3 hostile positions, 4th floor, south side." "Take the shots," Steele's voice commanded through their headsets. What happened next would be discussed in military circles for years to come. Sarah's rifle began firing with a precision and rapidity that defied conventional understanding of sniper operations. Each shot was delivered with mechanical precision, and each shot found its target with devastating accuracy. "Target 1 down," Thompson called out through his spotting scope. "Target 2 down. Target 3 down." The entire engagement lasted less than 30 seconds, but in that brief span of time, Sarah had eliminated 3 hostile combatants at a range of 400 meters while they were engaged in active combat with the assault team. "Jesus," Morrison's voice came through their communications. "Who was shooting? That was the most incredible suppressing fire I've ever seen." Thompson looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed awe with the beginning of genuine fear. "Who are you really?" Sarah was already tracking her rifle toward new targets as additional hostile forces appeared in and around the target building. "My codename is Ghost," she replied calmly. "And this operation is about to get much more interesting." The next phase of the operation would reveal capabilities that went far beyond exceptional marksmanship. As hostile forces continued to emerge from the target building and surrounding structures, Sarah's rifle continued its deadly work with a precision that seemed to transcend human limitations. Thompson realized that he wasn't just witnessing exceptional shooting. He was observing the emergence of something that would fundamentally change how military operations were conducted. The woman beside him wasn't just an expert marksman. She was a force of nature that had been carefully positioned for this exact moment. "Ghost to all teams," Sarah's voice was calm and controlled as she continued engaging targets with devastating efficiency. "I have visual on the hostages. They're being moved to the northeast stairwell. Redirect approach accordingly." Steele's voice responded immediately. "How can you see the hostages?" "You're 400 meters away." "Because," Sarah replied as her rifle claimed another target. "This entire operation was planned around getting me to exactly this position at exactly this moment." The legend of Ghost was being born in the crucible of urban combat, and the men of SEAL Team 7 were about to discover that they hadn't just gained a new team member. They had been privileged to witness the emergence of the most dangerous operator in modern military history. The rooftop had become a theater of impossible precision. Sarah's rifle spoke with mechanical regularity, each shot claiming a target with surgical accuracy that defied every principle of combat marksmanship Thompson had learned in 15 years of military service. She wasn't just eliminating hostile combatants. She was orchestrating the entire battle from her elevated position, directing the flow of engagement with the calm authority of someone conducting a symphony. Ghost, this is actual. Steele's voice crackled through their communications, using Sarah's revealed codename for the first time. We have visual on the hostages, but they're being moved toward a secondary exit. Can you provide coverage for alternate extraction route? Sarah's response came without pause in her shooting rhythm. Negative on secondary exit. Hostiles have prepared an ambush position at that location. Redirect through the northwest stairwell. I'll clear the path. Thompson watched in amazement as Sarah shifted her aim toward a section of the building where he saw no apparent targets. Her rifle fired twice in rapid succession, and, suddenly, muzzle flashes appeared from windows that had seemed empty moments before. How did you know they were there? Thompson asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I helped plan their defensive positions, Sarah replied, continuing her methodical elimination of threats. This entire scenario was wargamed months ago. The implications of her statement hit Thompson like a physical blow. Are you saying this whole operation was a setup? Not a setup, Sarah corrected, never taking her eye from her scope. A convergence. Multiple operations running simultaneously, each one providing cover and support for the others. Rodriguez's voice burst through their communications with urgent intensity. Ghost, we have a problem. Additional hostile forces are approaching from the east. Looks like military vehicles, possibly government forces responding to the engagement. Sarah's rifle swung toward the eastern approach, and Thompson could see vehicles moving rapidly through the streets in their direction. But, instead of appearing concerned, Sarah seemed almost relieved that this development was occurring. Right on schedule, she murmured, then spoke clearly into her microphone. All teams, be advised that government forces are not hostile. Repeat, government forces are not hostile. They're part of the operation. Morrison's voice carried disbelief and growing anger. What the hell does that mean? What operation? Before Sarah could respond, a new voice entered their communication channel. The voice carried the authority of senior command, speaking with crisp military precision. SEAL Team 7, this is Colonel Martinez, Venezuelan military intelligence. You are operating under joint authorization for a classified mission designated Operation Crosscurrent. The individual you know as Ghost is our primary operative for this mission. The silence that followed this announcement was deafening. Thompson stared at Sarah as the pieces began falling into place. Her knowledge of the area, her preparation for this specific mission, her confidence about tactical positions and enemy movements, all of it suddenly made sense. Sarah, Thompson said slowly, who do you really work for? Sarah finally looked away from her scope, meeting his gaze directly. I work for whoever needs the job done. Sometimes that's the United States. Sometimes it's other governments. In this case, it's both. Steele's voice cut through the communication channel with controlled fury. Ghost, explain your status immediately. Are you an American operator or not? I'm whatever the mission requires me to be, Sarah replied calmly. In this case, I'm the person who was positioned to ensure that Operation Nightfall succeeded while simultaneously completing a much larger objective. Williams joined the conversation from his position with the assault team. What larger objective? What the hell is really going on here? Sarah's rifle resumed its deadly work as she began eliminating the last remaining hostile positions in the target building. The hostage situation was real, but it was also convenient cover for eliminating a terrorist cell that has been operating in this area for the past 2 years. The building you're assaulting contains much more than 3 American diplomats. Rodriguez's voice carried growing understanding. You're saying this whole operation was designed to take down a larger terrorist operation? Among other things, Sarah confirmed. The cell leader, Carlos Mendez, has been coordinating attacks against American interests throughout South America. He's also been in communication with similar cells in Mexico and Colombia. Taking him down required careful coordination between multiple government agencies and intelligence services. Peterson's voice joined the chorus of confusion. So where's Mendez? Is he in the target building? Sarah's rifle fired once more, and, through his spotting scope, Thompson saw a figure in the building's top-floor window collapse backward into the room. He was, Sarah replied. The finality in her voice made it clear that Carlos Mendez would no longer be coordinating anything with anyone. But the larger implications of what had just occurred were only beginning to sink in for the members of SEAL Team 7. Ghost, Steele's voice carried a tone that Thompson had never heard before, something that mixed respect with wariness and perhaps a touch of fear. How long have you been planning this operation? 18 months, Sarah replied without hesitation. Mendez's organization has been under surveillance since they began targeting American diplomatic facilities. Every aspect of his operation has been mapped, every member of his network has been identified, and every contingency has been planned for. Morrison's voice carried disbelief. 18 months. That means you knew about Operation Nightfall before it was even conceived. Operation Nightfall was conceived as cover for this mission, Sarah explained. The hostage situation was allowed to develop because it provided the perfect pretext for inserting an American military team into Venezuelan territory to complete the larger objective. Thompson was staring at Sarah with an expression that mixed admiration with something approaching horror. The hostages, are they even in danger? They were never in any real danger, Sarah confirmed. They've been under protective surveillance since the moment they were taken. But their situation provided the necessary justification for this operation. The communication channel fell silent as the team members processed the magnitude of what they had just learned. They had been unwitting participants in an intelligence operation that spanned multiple countries and government agencies. Their mission had been successful, but it had also been something entirely different from what they had understood it to be. Steele's voice finally broke the silence, and when he spoke, his tone carried a quality that Thompson had never heard from his commander before. "Ghost, I need to understand something. Are there other operations like this? Other missions where military teams are deployed without understanding the larger picture?" Sarah's response would become legendary in the military intelligence community, repeated in briefings and training sessions for years to come. "Commander, there are things happening in the world that require coordination between agencies and governments that most people don't even know exist. Sometimes the best way to ensure mission success is to make sure that everyone involved understands only the part of the operation they need to execute." Peterson's voice carried frustration and growing anger. "So we're just pawns in some larger game that we don't get to understand. You're elite operators who were selected for this mission because of your exceptional capabilities," Sarah replied. "But, yes, sometimes that means executing missions without understanding the complete strategic picture." Rodriguez spoke up with a question that went to the heart of every operator's concern about trust and accountability. "How do we know that our objectives align with American interests if we don't understand what we're really doing?" Sarah's answer would be remembered as the moment when the legend of Ghost truly emerged, when the woman who had asked for the rifle demonstrated that her capabilities extended far beyond exceptional marksmanship. "Because," she said, her voice carrying absolute certainty, "I don't take missions unless I know they serve the interests of people who deserve protection. Every target I eliminate, every operation I complete, every mission I accept is based on intelligence that I personally verify." Thompson realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in his military experience. Sarah wasn't just following orders or executing predetermined plans. She was operating as an autonomous agent who made her own determinations about mission validity and strategic value. "Sarah," he said slowly, "how many operations like this have you been involved in?" "More than you would believe," she replied. "Fewer than the world actually needs." Williams voiced the question that was now on everyone's mind. "What happens now? Do we just pretend this conversation never happened?" "You report that Operation Nightfall was successful," Sarah said. 3 American diplomats were successfully extracted, and a terrorist cell was eliminated in the process. Everything else is classified at levels that don't concern your unit. Morrison's voice carried a tone of challenge. "And if we decide that's not acceptable? If we decide that we need more answers about what really happened here?" Sarah's response carried a chill that made the tropical night seem cold. "Then, you'll discover that there are aspects of military operations that exist beyond the reach of normal command structure. Some things are classified not just for operational security, but for the protection of people who ask too many questions." Steele's voice cut through the tension with the authority of command. "Stand down, Morrison. This conversation ends here." But Thompson could hear something in Steele's voice that he had never heard before: uncertainty. For the first time in their relationship, Commander Marcus Steele sounded like a man who had encountered something beyond his understanding and control. "Ghost," Steele said, using Sarah's codename with new respect, "will we work together again?" Sarah was already beginning to disassemble her rifle, her movements efficient and purposeful. "That depends on what missions arise and what capabilities are needed. But, Commander, you should understand that this operation has elevated your team's clearance level considerably. You may find yourselves being called for missions that are quite different from your previous assignments." As the team began their extraction procedures, Thompson remained on the rooftop with Sarah, watching her pack equipment with the same methodical precision she had demonstrated throughout the operation. "Sarah," he said quietly, "I need to ask you something directly. Are you human?" She looked up from her equipment with the first genuine smile he had seen from her since they met. "Thompson, I'm very human. But I've been trained by people who understand that human capabilities can be enhanced far beyond what most people believe is possible." Enhanced how? Through preparation, through training, through understanding that the difference between impossible and inevitable is usually just a matter of planning and commitment. Thompson nodded slowly, understanding that he had learned everything he was going to learn about the woman who had just redefined his understanding of what elite operators could accomplish. As they prepared to leave the rooftop, Thompson realized that this night would mark a fundamental change in how he understood military operations. He had witnessed the emergence of something that transcended traditional concepts of soldier, spy, and strategist. The legend of Ghost had been born not just through exceptional marksmanship, but through a demonstration of capabilities that seemed to operate beyond normal human limitations. And Commander Steele, the man who had questioned her presence on his team, would carry the memory of this night for the rest of his career. In briefings and training sessions for years to come, when military commanders discussed the theoretical limits of human capability in combat operations, someone would inevitably mention the night when a woman who asked for the rifle silenced one of the most decorated commanders in military history. Not through confrontation or challenge, but through the simple demonstration that some individuals operate at levels of capability that redefine what's possible in modern warfare. The legend of Ghost had been born, and the world of elite military operations would never be quite the same.